You can explore more of your favourite CBeebies shows on BBC iPlayer.
Sing us a song, Mrs. Weaver! Yeah!
Oh, I don't know.
Please?
Well, yeah! Don't think because I'm an animal that I don't sing. I got a heart and a brain and some hips to swing. Give me the space to move and the air to breathe, and I will give you a bottom-shaking melody.
We like that sound. We like the way it goes. You can feel it from our heads right down to our toes.
It's all about the feeling that you get inside. You make a shape with your mouth and your lungs are applied. From down into your soul, now here it comes. It's a burst and a roll of drums. It's all about the beat and the feel of the groove. And with a little harmony, I do approve. There ain't no rules, you can sing how you like. In the back, on the stage, on your sister's bike. You can chorus, you can growl, you can blow, and you can buzz. Doesn't matter what the noise is that the song does. The point ain't to impress or be assessed. Some people might do that, but nevertheless, you don't sing for awards or a pat on the back. You don't sing just to win tag, remember that. Whether you're in tweeds or jeans or sporting a nappy, you've only got to sing to make you feel happy. You wanna sing, wanna dance, jump up off the ground, open up wide and make that sound. Keep your gold and your diamonds and your rubies too, because singing's all a beaver really wants to do.
Gold and diamonds and your rubies too. 'Cause singing's all a squirrel really wants to do. Singing about the sun, singing about my mum, singing about my favourite fruit, the Japanese plum, singing about the moon, singing about singing only slightly out of tune.
So if you're down in the dumps or feeling sad, there is something you can do to make things less bad. It's a song. Take it, squirrels. It's a song.
Singing out the crowd, singing on your own or in a crowd, singing very quickly or singing very slow, singing up high or singing down low.
Singing, singing to sleep. It's a sleepy song. Singing, singing to sleep. Bed is where you belong. Singing, singing to sleep. It's a sleepy song. Singing, singing to sleep. Bed is where you belong. Waving, waving goodbye. This is a goodbye song. Singing, singing goodbye. We'll be home before long.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. But where are the stars and the big, big moon?
The moon hasn't risen yet, Bee.
There aren't any stars or any big, big moon yet. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. When the sun has gone to bed, the big, big moon will lift his head. If you live
number one. Once learned, never forgotten. It's one straight line from top to bottom, and now you've seen just how it's done. You'll always know how to draw the number one. Let's all draw the number two. Let's keep up the pace. Around and down, then across the base. That's truly all you need to do. Now you know how to draw the number two. Let's all draw the number three. We're going to tell you when. Go round in a curve, then around again. And if you're stuck, then copy me as we show you all how to draw the number three. Let's all draw the number four. Try to copy mine. Draw down and across, then cut the line. It's never going to be a chore. Now you know how to draw the number four. 5. Don't let the party stop. Draw down and around, then across at the top. 6. We're cock a hoop. Start with a curve and go round in a loop. We're 7. No need to wear a frown. It's one flat line and one line down. 7. Let's all draw the number 8. Let's get this off the ground. Start with an S, then loop back around. It's always going to turn out great. Now you know how to draw the number 8. Let's all draw the number 9. We're really going to town. Start with a loop, then a line straight down. This is how those two combine. The easy way to draw the number 9. Let's all draw the number 10. Draw a 1 and an oval then. Do it once, you can do it again. Now you've learned how to draw all the numbers up to 10.
It's the Veg-O-Vision Song Contest. I'm Rylan, and I'm bringing all fruit and veggies together to celebrate music from across the supermarket. Whether you're a root veg or a stem veg, a leaf veg or a seed veg, Broccoli and I have a Veg-O-Vision song for you. First up, it's a pop banger for Supertato.
Supertato is always there for you. Along with carrots, there is nothing they can't do. Sing it together. Oh, there's no one better than Supertato. Oh, Supertato. Such a good friend and a veggie hero.
Next up, some techno polka for Chili.
Chili, chili, oh so hot. Ain't no spicy, well you're dodge. No one else can just combust. Quite like chili can. Chili, chili, don't be silly. Stay out of his way. He'll be your friend, but in the end, he's spicy as can be. Chili! Chili! Cha-cha-cha-cha-cha-cha. Chili! Cha-cha-cha-cha-cha-cha.
Wow, we've come to the point of the show where we grab a tissue and dial up the drama. It's a ballad for Tomato.
Every day he wakes up and he tries to catch up to the feelings in his heart. On the vine, life was fine, but there's so much more to the feelings he feels inside. Did you listen when I said there's more to life than being red, than being red?
That's just beautiful. But, what's this? Oh no, it's a song for Evie.
There's no one better than being red. She's the bee with the sweet little evil plan. Don't be distracted by her size, or she will take you by surprise.
didn't see you there, Jojo. Jojo, I think it's time for a Gran Gran plan. Let's sing a song.
Nature tick book, pencil, ready to tick everything we see, magnifying glass, and panda, of course.
Explore outside. There's such a wonderful world around us, and living things surround us. Explore outside. The parks, the gardens, and the beaches. The nature club teaches us to look up close, get down low, watch and wait, take it slow. If we look very carefully, what can we see? There is a pond, it's full of tadpoles, fish, and jumping frogs. And in the garden, toads are hiding under logs. Enjoy the park. The bees are buzzing, can you hear? And in the woods, we spy a deer. Explore outside. There's such a wonderful world around us, and living things surround us. Explore outside. The parks, the gardens, and the beaches. The nature club teaches us to look up close, get down low, watch and wait, take it slow. If we look very carefully, what can we see? Look at the tree. Birds are busy building nests, and on a flag, a butterfly stops to take a rest. We found a pool. A crab is crawling on a rock, and in the sky, the seagulls flock.
Well done, Nature Club!
Explore outside. There's such a wonderful world around us,
I can hear something.
and living things surround us. Explore outside.
Look!
The parks, the gardens, and the beaches. The plants and the creatures that share our wonderful world.
Yay!
All is well. Close the books, ring the bell. No more tricky words to spell. It's our free time. Out the door, down the hall. Jump the fence, climb the wall. To the park, kick the ball. Until tea time. After school, run around, play the fool. Now it's done, we'll have fun. After school, trampoline or swimming pool. Scream and shout, run about. After school. Who's that scary creature? Could it be the teacher? Teachers say that you'll be kind. Please don't make me stay behind. Meeting up with your friends, hiding out secret dens. Time you hope never ends. Sun will shine now. Funny jokes, crazy games. On the swings, climbing frames. Ride your bike down the lanes. All is fine now. After school, play guitar, play groove. Sing your song while you're young. After school. That is where all kids roll. But tomorrow comes an end. We'll head back to school again. Back to school.
If Biscuit wears this, it'll cover her further up and she won't be embarrassed anymore.
Yes, Dodge, but won't she look a little bit silly if she's the only one wearing a paper hat?
Ah, she won't be the only one. We'll all wear them!
Friends who stick together will stay that way forever. We'll take your side whatever and stand right next to you. Whenever you're in bother, you know we've got each other. Like sisters or a brother, your friends will be the glue. Friends are the ones who will always be there, holding you up when you're feeling down. 'Cause friends will be near when there's problems to share, giving a smile, showing they care. Yeah! Friends who stick together will stay that way forever. We'll take your side whatever and stand right next to you. Whenever you're in bother, you know we've got each other. Look out for one another. Your friends will be the glue.
Do you love CBeebies? Well, you can learn, sing and explore with all your favourite CBeebies friends like Numberblocks, Mr Tumble, Bluey, JoJo Gran Gran and so much more. Why not ask your grown-up to download the BBC iPlayer app where you can watch all your favourite CBeebies friends anytime, anywhere you like.